Before I start tonight, and while someone is getting the lights, some of you know about this, but 1 week ago today, we lost someone who was very influential in the later history of Jefferson School. Dr. Margaret Gayasitz passed away 1 week ago today. She served as principal of Jefferson Elementary from 1991 to 2003. I met Marge about 4 or 5 years ago. I went to her home and interviewed her, and I'll be talking about her part in Jefferson in the September presentation. And she was very kind to me. She was very interested in what I was doing. And since we're talking about Jefferson tonight, I thought it would be appropriate to mention that someone who was so important in the history of the school, even though we're not talking about that part of the history tonight, I just wanted to mention this. So some of you have heard about this. I'm sure if she could have, she would have loved to be here. And unfortunately, time caught up with her and she couldn't. Okay. And now I will start my presentation. Thank you all for coming. Emmaus in the 1960s was a great place and time for a boy to grow up. I rode my bike all over this town and the surrounding areas. Close to home, there were 2 great playgrounds less than a block away. To the west was Lions Playground, which had a nice baseball field. To the east was Jefferson Playground. I entered kindergarten in 1961, the year that Jefferson became an elementary school. I grew up on that playground. I knew every inch of it. I knew all the trees along Elm Street and which ones could be climbed. I played basketball at night on the Jefferson Playground for hours, illuminated by the streetlights on Elm Street. Jefferson was a huge part of my early life. I volunteered a few years ago to do a presentation on the history of Jefferson. Most of what you will hear tonight, I have learned in the last year. It has been a time of joyful discovery for me. I have learned a lot. I've solved some mysteries, and some mysteries I haven't been able to solve. I've been helped along the way by many people, and I'm very grateful to each one. There are 3 gentlemen who have been especially helpful to me, and I want to publicly thank Bill Bardo, Andrew Kerstetter, and Neil Moyer for all your help. This presentation tonight will be better than it would have been without their help. First, I want to show you or tell you a little bit about my family. This picture was taken in the 1970s when I was in college. Many of you knew my older siblings. Faye was the oldest. She graduated from Emmaus High School in 1949. I'm going to try to focus this a little better. I think that's better. Faye graduated from Emmaus High School in 1949, and she passed away in 2016. Second was my sister Carol. Carol is still living. She is not here with us tonight. She graduated in 1952. Third was my brother Jack. He graduated in 1954. And he passed away in 2015. Next was Elaine. She graduated in 1955, the last year that Jefferson was the high school. And she passed away also in 2015. Next is Linda, who is with us tonight. She graduated in 1963. She attended Jefferson for junior high school. And finally, there was me. I graduated in 1974, and I attended Jefferson for kindergarten through 6th grade. My mother, Dorothy, volunteered in the Jefferson Library. My father, Malin, is the only one in the family that did not have a connection to Jefferson. However, had he not moved his young family to Emmaus in 1939, none of us would have had a connection to Jefferson. I wonder if there are other families in Emmaus like mine, where at least one sibling attended Jefferson for high school, at least one for junior high, and at least one for elementary school. There's something else very unusual about my family. There was a 25-year gap from oldest to youngest. Faye married fairly young and started a family fairly quickly. This resulted in her having a 4-year-old daughter by the time I was born. This means I was an uncle the day I was born, and I had a niece who was 4 years older than I was. So who was this niece who was older than I was? Well, some of you knew her. She was Lynette Cox Fink. She has presented here. And this picture was taken in 2019, just a few months before she passed away. So I would like to dedicate this presentation tonight to my departed siblings, Faye, Jack, and Elaine, my departed niece, Lynette, and to Dr. Margaret Gayasitz. Now, the reason that Jefferson was built is simple. 2 words: school overcrowding. But there are more factors that led to school overcrowding than you may realize. Let's talk about the important ones. This is the obvious one. Fueled by immigration, the population of the United States, including Emmaus, was growing rapidly. Here is a graph to illustrate. In 1880, Emmaus had 847 residents. By 1900, the population had nearly doubled to 1468. By 1910, the population was 3,501, more than 4 times the population of 30 years earlier. Another important factor was the introduction of compulsory education laws. In Pennsylvania, a law was enacted in 1895 which required that children ages 8 to 13 attend school. In 1933, the age was raised to 16. This is not the same thing as compulsory education laws, but it is related. In 1915, following the lead of other states, Pennsylvania passed an Employment Act which required that children between the ages of 14 and 16 can work no more than 51 hours per week, and at least 8 of those hours must be spent in school. The school districts across the state were responsible for implementing this new requirement. These classes had to be held somewhere. This went into effect after Jefferson was built, but the school board knew what was coming. Finally, students were staying in school longer. In 1900, only 11% of children aged 14 to 17 attended school. Part of the reason for students staying in school longer is that more people saw the benefits of formal education. Also, more options for study in high school were developed. And another factor that kept students in school longer is that the high school went from a 2-year program to a 3-year program and then to a 4-year program. These factors were not unique to Emmaus. They existed all over the country, and starting in the late 1800s and especially into the 1900s, there was intense pressure on every local school board to stay one step ahead of the law by providing sufficient educational facilities in their communities. The building of Jefferson was part of the solution to these challenges that were faced in Emos. To better put the building of Jefferson in context, we can go back even further in time and examine a brief timeline. As most of you know, Emmaus was at first a closed Moravian community. There is much written about education in Emmaus under the Moravians in the excellent book, They Came to Emmaus. In the 1800s, Emmaus was open to non-Moravians. In 1859, Emmaus was incorporated as a borough under the name of Emos. The Emos School District was first recognized by the state in the 1860-61 school year. In the early days, all schooling was done at the Main Street Schoolhouse, which was part of the Moravian complex. The schoolhouse was purchased by the school district in 1877. There were as many as 4 classrooms in this building. The high school was started in 1888 as a 2-year program. The first graduation was in 1890. There were 2 graduates. Here is a picture of the diploma of one of those first graduates. In 1890, the school principal earned $52 per month for 8 months. In 1891, the Central School building was built at a cost of $15,000. It had 4 classrooms. Central was also called the Emos Schoolhouse. At this point, the Main Street building was no longer used. In 1899, Central was expanded to 8 classrooms at a cost of $5,000. In 1903, when Emos annexed parts of 2 adjacent townships, it proved necessary to reopen the Main Street building. Also, at some point, another small school building, the 6th Street building, was added to the mix. This building was located at 6th and Minor Streets and had 2 classrooms. All of these buildings were bursting with children, and in 1910, the Washington School was built at a cost of $21,000. Washington had 8 classrooms and was dedicated in January 1911. At this point, the Main Street building was abandoned for good this time. The 6th Street building was also put up for sale at 2 different times, but it did not sell. Good thing, because by 1912 it was being used again. I read a funny story from 1914 about the 6th Street School. A boy was caught vandalizing the building. He broke windows and he tore the roofing paper off the bathrooms. I thought, roofing paper on bathrooms? Then it hit me. This was 1914. They were outhouses. In 1912, the school board decided that the high school program would be changed from 2 to 3 years. On May 15, 1914, the Emos School Board met and discussed the urgent need to build another school. The board had the authority to raise taxes to fund the building of the school. However, they wanted the support of the residents. They decided to hold a public meeting on June 9th. The meeting was held at 4th and Main, what we now call the Triangle. A presentation to the public was made by Robert Stoneback, school board president. Stoneback graduated from Emos High School in 1897. Here he is pictured with his wife, Lily. Stoneback explained the severe overcrowding in the schools. Below 7th grade, the average class in town had 50 students, with 2 classes over 60. He revealed that the new school would be built on a series of lots located on North Street between 5th and 6th, purchased some time ago for $1,600. The lots were 160 by 220 feet, which is 0.8 acres. I was unable to find out who the land was purchased from and when. There is a second mystery. The 0.8 acres is less than half of the 1.9 acres which Jefferson ultimately had. This is a map of the block containing Jefferson. This is North Street, Elm Street, Perkiomen Street, the alley next to the school. This is Moyer Street, the alley to the west. 6th Street would be over here, and 5th Street over here. This was the original plot where the school and all of its additions were built. There is an additional lot of 1.1 acres of building lots on Elm Street, which became the playground. I also cannot find any record of the purchase of the 1.1 acre section. Stoneback explained that the school board's preference was to borrow $25,000 to $30,000 to fund the new school. This would require a special election to authorize an increase in the school district's indebtedness. The turnout at the meeting was light, but public reaction was positive. An architect was hired to determine the size of the loan that would be needed. A special election was held on August 28, 1914, for the public to approve a loan of $28,000. It was approved overwhelmingly. Following the successful vote, architect Ephraim Picken began finishing the plans for the new school building. The new building will have 8 classrooms, 24 by 32 feet, all facing North Street. There will be no auditorium or gymnasium. The basement will be partitioned into sections for future use. The outside structure will be Port Murray brick with terracotta trimmings. The building will be heated by steam. The plans were completed and approved by the State Board of Education on September 4th, 1914. The invitation to bid was published on September 10th. The bids were opened September 23rd, and contracts were awarded September 25th, 1914. Arthur Hauser of Emos was the successful bidder on the building. Mr. Hauser built many houses in Emos in this time period. The total contract price of the building was just over $29,000. The building is to be completed by July 1st, 1915. In a school board meeting on October 2nd, 1914, the school board announced that the name of the new school building will be the Jefferson Building. Here are some key dates during the construction of Jefferson. October 1st, 1914, excavation begins. October 15th, concrete work begins. November 28th, ironwork arrived. May 17th, 1915, Jefferson under roof this week. July 16th, contract awarded for sidewalks. In a 1998 interview published in the Morning Call, a 100-year-old man who witnessed the construction of Jefferson as a teenager mentioned that horses were used during the construction. This was not unusual for this time period. The construction was not trouble-free. In March, construction had to be stopped until the frost was out of the walls, and some of the walls had to be torn down and rebuilt. In July, vandals marred the freshly white-coated walls by throwing yellow clay balls at them. The school board offered a $5 reward for information leading to the arrest of the vandals. That was real money then. The school was completed a little late, but it was ready for the start of the 1915-16 school year. The Emos School Board decided that Jefferson would be dedicated on August 28, 1915. An elaborate ceremony was planned. However, because of inclement weather, it was rescheduled for September 18th, after school had already begun. Dedication festivities began with a parade of EMOS school students from Central School to Jefferson. Senior class president Ira Klein led the high school students who carried class pennants and performed drills along the way. The girls wore white midi blouses with red bows in their hair. The boys wore white waistcoats. Floyd Yobst of the Allentown Democrat reported that they presented a knobby appearance. When they arrived at Jefferson, the school children, 600 strong, massed on the front lawn and waved flags, a memorable scene. Music was provided by the EMOS band and by singing of the school children. The invocation was performed by Reverend Daniel Schaefer of the St. John's Reformed Church. There were various speeches by local dignitaries. The keys to the building were presented by architect Picken and accepted by School Board President Stoneback. The Jefferson building was described by the newspapers as the most magnificent building in town and a splendid new building. Here is a very early photo of Jefferson, which I love. In later years, it would be impossible to stand directly in front of the school and take a picture of the entire school. The school was too big, and the houses across the street prevented you from getting back far enough. Not a problem on this picture. Why? The houses across the street hadn't been built yet. The photographer is standing in a field between Ridge and North Streets, facing north. This picture does prove that Jefferson was built before the houses across the street. It also gives a good sense that this was at the edge of town in 1915. In fact, this was not even part of EMOS until 1903. You can see on the right-hand side a few houses along North Fifth Street. And notice this building to the left of the school. I'll be talking about that in my September presentation. In this section, we will find out who occupied Jefferson over the years. Meet the class of 1916. This class was the first class to have a class book and was the first class to wear caps and gowns at their graduation. Jefferson was ready for use in the fall of 1915, and you would think that the class of 1916 would have graduated from Jefferson, but that was not the case. They graduated from Central. Although they did use the basement of Jefferson for 2 socials during their senior year. In fact, there were no high school students at Jefferson the first year. And surprisingly, only 3 of the 8 classrooms were used during the first year. I have no idea why, given the school overcrowding, that Jefferson was not fully utilized at the beginning. But let's meet the first 3 teachers who taught at Jefferson. This is Florence Miller. She taught first grade. Florence was a graduate of EMOS High School and Keystone State Normal School. She taught at Jefferson for 4 years, but I found no mention of her after 1920. This is Emma Kratzer. She taught 2nd and 3rd grade. We know much more about Emma. She was born in 1888 and graduated from EMOS High School in 1903. She began teaching in EMOS in 1906 at age 18. She taught at the Main Street School and then at Washington before coming to Jefferson. Emma seems to have been a young woman of means. By her early 20s, she owned her own home on North Fifth Street and hosted lavish parties there. She was active in the Daughters of America and also the Modern Priscillas, a church sewing group. Emma taught elementary children at Jefferson until January 1929 when Lincoln opened. Here is Miss Kratzer's class for 1922-23. Here is her class from a few years later. There was no date on the picture, but we did have a list of names which helped us. See this little shaver right there? That's Andrew Kerstetter's grandfather. Based on his year of birth, we were able to figure out that this was probably the 1927-28 school year, the last full year of elementary students at Jefferson until the 1960s. When Lincoln opened, Emma Kratzer was the first principal. But when school opened in the fall of 1929, she went back to being a teacher. In later years, Emma taught at Central. She retired in 1951 after 45 years of teaching. She died in 1967 at age 79. Here is the last of the original Jefferson teachers. Some of you know who this is. Others may be wondering who this baby-faced gentleman is. Perhaps seeing what he looked like 40 years later would be helpful. Yes, it is Alan Heller, who would be named Emos High School principal in 1927 and who held that post until the new high school opened in 1955. In 1915, he taught a class of 7th graders and advanced 5th graders, an odd combination. Heller was born in 1889 and graduated from Emos High School in 1904. He graduated from Keystone State Normal School in 1907 and began teaching in Emos in 1909. By the end of the 1915-16 school year, he was replaced by another teacher and he took over the continuation school. He probably developed the curriculum. After a short time, someone else took that over and he became the main high school teacher. Reading about Alan Heller has given me a high regard for him. He was a man of dedication and integrity. He was involved in just about everything. In 1913, he played a major role in the establishment of the Home and School League, a forerunner of the PTA. He started a high school chorus in 1919. Outside of school, he was deeply involved in leadership of the Boy Scouts, and he was Sunday school superintendent at his church. After the high school moved to its new location in 1955, Heller stayed behind and was principal of the junior high school for 2 years before retiring in 1957. Heller died in 1973 and is buried at Northwood, not far from my parents. In June 1916, the school board announced a new high school course, which I presume was the commercial course. In the fall of 1916, the high school would move to Jefferson and occupy the 2nd floor. This slide shows the student population at Jefferson in 1919. In the fall of 1926, 7th and 8th graders were transferred to Jefferson. In the fall of 1928, the district started its first kindergarten. It was supposed to be at Lincoln, but when Lincoln wasn't ready, the kindergarten was held at Jefferson instead. In January 1929, when Lincoln opened, the elementary students were transferred there. 7th graders were moved to Lincoln in 1936. In 1939, the 8th graders were also moved. And finally, after a quarter century, Jefferson was occupied by high school students only. In 1947, Jefferson became so crowded that about half of the 9th graders attended Lincoln. This was the case for the last 8 years of the high school at Jefferson. The story of the additions to the Jefferson building has a lot of twists and turns, especially the auditorium. Recall that the original building had 8 classrooms, all facing North Street, with no auditorium and no gymnasium. This diagram was published in the Morning Call on July 9th, 1914, before the vote. Here are the 4 classrooms that were built at first. Here and here are classrooms that were added later. This is a plan for the first floor of Jefferson, by the way. And here is an auditorium. The architect did include an auditorium in the original plans, but the school board did not choose to build it right away because it would have cost an additional $10,000. The school board was trying to keep the cost as low as possible. After Jefferson was built, almost immediately there was pressure from students, parents, alumni, and the general public to add an auditorium. Many believed that there was just not an adequate auditorium anywhere in Emos. I believe the school board wanted the public to demand an auditorium rather than the school board shoving one down the throats of the residents. In July 1919, a petition signed by nearly 500 residents was presented to the Emos School Board, requesting that they build an auditorium at Jefferson. The school board directed their attorney to begin the process for a special election to increase indebtedness of the school district. This was the same approach they used when preparing to build the original building. However, on September 16, 1919, the ballot question was defeated by 23 votes. All was quiet for over 3 years, but then in March 1923, another election was held to authorize a bond issue of $65,000 for the building of an auditorium and an addition of 6 classrooms to the school. This time, the ballot measure passed. Bids were solicited, and in June 1923, the school board found out to their disappointment that all of the bids were too high. They decided to put the overall building project on indefinite hold and authorize simply building an annex on the west side of the building, which would include 2 new classrooms. The approximate cost would be $20,000. The board wanted the annex completed by the fall of 1923, but it was not finished for several months after that. Here is a picture from the 1924 Tatler showing the West Annex over here, the first addition to the school. In later years, the second floor of the West Annex had 2 classrooms. The next thing I found was an article from November 1923 reporting that the school board opened bids for the new auditorium. The low bidder was John Loudenslager at just under $35,000. I am obviously missing something. I could not find what happened leading up to 1923 to resurrect the auditorium. And I have not found what happened between June and November 1923 to resurrect it a second time. I will point out that $20,000 for the West Annex plus $35,000 for the auditorium comes in below the $65,000 figure for the bond issue. Now it gets really interesting. The auditorium was finished just in time for its first event, which was held in November 1924. The school board decided in October 1924 to finish and equip the gymnasium. This was the first mention I found of the gymnasium. But then it was reported on November 8, 1924, that the basement is being dug in preparation for the construction of the gymnasium. I thought, this is crazy. Why would you build an auditorium and then dig underneath it for a gymnasium? Then we have this headline from January 11th, 1925. The article says the ground has been removed to the necessary depth and good progress is being made. It also says that a swimming pool was under consideration. That did not happen, although many alumni of Jefferson would say, yes, we did have a swimming pool. Every time it rained, we had a swimming pool in the gym. But back to the digging of the gym. I found an important clue in the January 1924 issue of the Monthly Tatler. A student writer reported that a steam shovel was brought in to excavate the cellar and that the work began on December 6, 1923. Now this makes sense. If the school board had any thought that they might someday build a gymnasium under the auditorium, obviously they would have dug out the gym before they finished the auditorium. But then what was the second digging that began almost a year later? This puzzled me for a long time, but after discussing it with a construction expert, I think I now understand it. This photo was taken in 1998, just before demolition. The key is to recognize that if you include the bleachers, the gym extended 10 to 15 feet beyond the walls of the auditorium in both directions. This stairway right here leads down to the west basement hallway. That hallway had a door that opened right to the back of the bleachers. I believe the second digging was right here on both sides. There was no need to dig there until they knew for sure that they were going to finish the gym. So that's where I think that was. However, there is still a mystery. Where did the money come from to finish the gym? I have no idea. The gym was finished in late 1925. In January 1926, the school board decided to add another annex to the school, this time on the east side. This was the final addition to the building. Later in 1926, a new bond issue of $32,000 was floated. This is a picture taken during construction of the East Annex. This photo, taken during demolition in 1998, shows the East Annex. The East Annex had 2 classrooms on each floor. I believe that the East and the West Annexes were the same size, but I have not located a set of prints to prove it. One other interesting detail about the East Annex construction is that a locker room on the east side of the gym was included. This makes perfect sense, but it also implies that for the first year of the gym, there was only one locker room, the one on the west side. Also, notice the yellow brick coating on the building in this photo. This is a picture of the manual training room from the 1926 Tatler. This room was somewhere in the basement. The room was used by the high school, but also junior high students would walk from Central to Jefferson to use the room. This is a main reason why the junior high grades were transferred to Jefferson soon after. Recall the yellow brick coating I mentioned a moment ago. This was not part of the original building. Here we have side-by-side pictures, one from 1940 and one from 1945. Even though the pictures are black and white, if you look closely, you can clearly see the difference. Somewhere between 1940 and 1945, the yellow brick coating was added. I found that the coating was applied in 1943. The color of the building is now a golden yellow. I do have additional details which may interest some of you, which you may ask me about during Q&A. In this part of my presentation, I will cover some interesting uses of Jefferson facilities other than the normal classroom instruction. In the early days of Jefferson, the basement was a popular spot for events. I mentioned earlier that the class of 1916, though they did not attend Jefferson, they did have 2 socials in the basement. The first record I found of a community group using Jefferson was a Boy Scouts event in January 1917. Alan Heller was very active in Boy Scouts. Now, this was a big day in old Emos. What better way to spend a cold Saturday afternoon than to attend a corn show? What do people do at a corn show? I guess they walk around and look at everyone's ears. In October 1924, on the eve of the completion of the auditorium, a series of events was announced called the High School Entertainment Course. In each of these events, there would be entertainment and a lecture. The first event in the series, held November 10th, 1924, featured Hazel DeFeed, an entertainer and radio actress. She was accompanied by cellist Pauline DeFeed and pianist Richard Williams. If anyone finds a ticket for this show in your attic, that would be quite a find, and Andrew will be pounding on your door. Switching to the gymnasium, the first basketball game played there was held on November 27th, 1925. The Emos High School teams defeated alumni teams. I found an article from 1927 which reported that the school board granted permission to the Ku Klux Klan to use Jefferson for an activity. I found no record of the event actually taking place. Now here is a remarkable picture. This picture was taken March 4th, 1929, from the stage of the Jefferson Auditorium. Notice the massive radio on the stage. The students are listening to the inauguration of President Herbert Hoover. This was the first presidential inauguration broadcast nationwide on radio. In 1934, Emos celebrated its Diamond Jubilee, the celebration of the borough's 75th anniversary. Many of the festivities were held at Jefferson. Here we see the platform that was set up on the playground. As I was doing research, Neil Moyer told me one day that he had heard as a student that there was a rifle range in the Jefferson Gymnasium. I told him that I had found mention of a rifle club in the 1943 Tatler, but I would dig deeper. When I did, I found an article with this amazing photograph. A few months after our entry into World War II, as part of the Civilian Defense Program and in cooperation with the National Rifle Association, instructors from UNAMI trained a group of local ladies how to safely use a rifle. This training was then expanded to training teenagers, and it went on every winter for many years. I have one more really cool auditorium picture. The year is 1952. Pictured is the faculty and staff of the entire school district. What are they reading and why are they raising their hands? Well, think about what was going on in 1952. It was the height of the Cold War. We were fighting in Korea. Senator Joe McCarthy was riding high in Washington. Anti-communist fervor was at a fever pitch. These faculty and staff are taking a loyalty oath. And right there is Mr. Heller, right in the middle, third row from the back. Now let's consider the high school academic program. This slide shows the high school course of study, which was printed in the 1916 class book. This was a 3-year program. Notice first that 9th graders were called juniors, 10th graders were called middlers, and 11th graders were called seniors. Notice that the course of study was a very rigorous one. Every student took the same classes. The program was definitely geared to those who were planning to pursue higher education. Those who wanted to work in a factory or learn a trade would drop out after 8th grade. and in earlier years, many did not make it that far. From 1890 to 1910, Emos High School graduated 120 students. 40% of them became teachers. Also, if you have a sharp eye and you're good at spelling, you'll notice that they spelled semester wrong. As I mentioned earlier, a new course was added in the fall of 1916. My hunch is that this is when the commercial course was added. In June 1918, the school board announced that all students starting high school in the 1919-20 school year would be required to complete a four-year program to get a diploma. Once the four-year program began, the familiar freshman, sophomore, junior, senior system of classification began to be used. In the late 1920s, more practical subjects were introduced in the school. In 1926, wood and metal shops started. 1927 saw cooking added. And in 1928, mechanical drawing, sewing, and penmanship arrived. In 1929, the high school began using letter grades. By 1938, there were academic, commercial, and general courses available. Industrial was added in 1947. The constraints of time force me to limit what I can cover here, so I will discuss football and one other sport. I couldn't believe it when I saw this picture in the 1923 Tatler. A tennis team in 1923? I was on the high school tennis team when I was in high school, so I was very interested. My first question was, where did they play? Were there really tennis courts in Emos that long ago? Well, I did some digging and I found the answer. In 1909, the Emos Lawn Tennis Association, yes, there was such a group, leased a vacant lot at 5th and Minor Streets and then installed 2 tennis courts, probably grass courts. One of the active members was none other than Alan Heller. I believe he took the lead in organizing a tennis team at the high school at Jefferson, and the team used the courts at 5th and Minor. In 1928, this article appeared in the Monthly Tatler. I also found later references to the high school tennis courts. This would make it appear that there were, at one time, tennis courts on the Jefferson playground. I am skeptical, so I am designating this as an unsolved mystery. I would need to see a picture or some other proof to convince me. Now, regarding football, Emos High School had a team from about 1900 to 1910 prior to Jefferson, but then it was dropped. In September 1928, the school board authorized the creation of a football team. Here is the 1928 football team, the first one at Jefferson. I realize the football says 1929, but I proved to myself that this was in fact the 1928 team. The team played its home games at a field on Seam Street near the State Highway. The first home game was played October 20th, 1928, and Emos lost 19-0. The first known pep rally at Jefferson was held in the auditorium at the start of the 1929 season. In the 1920s, a little resort was created on the edge of town near the Fifth Street Mountain. It was called Bide-A-Wee Park. When the Depression hit, some of the investors had trouble making their payments, and the park fell on hard times. In 1930, the Emos School Board agreed to purchase the land, which became the 4th Street Field. The first game at the 4th Street Field was played October 3rd, 1931. Emos lost to Stroudsburg. In 1932, the school colors changed from blue and gray to green and gold. Also, in the 1930s, the Green Hornet name was created. Before that, the Emos teams were the Gray Wolves, and before that, the Moravians. Here is an action photo from the 1949 Catasauqua game. Of course, if you have a football team, you need cheerleaders. Here is one of the all-time best Emmaus cheerleaders, my sister Carol. This picture was taken in 1951. Carol told me that if Emmaus won a home game, on their way back to Jefferson, the cheerleaders would stop and do cheers on Chestnut Street. My own sister holding up traffic on Chestnut Street. If our father ever would have been caught in that traffic, she would have heard about it. And there was, in one of the Tattlers, there was a cheer called the Akalaka-Ching, and it shows Carol doing this cheer. And I've been teasing her about this, and she cannot remember what the Akalaka-Ching was. But it was a cheer done back in the 1950s. In addition to academics and athletics, many other extracurricular activities took place at Jefferson. Debating was very prominent in the early days of the high school at Jefferson. There were several other clubs with an academic focus, such as astronomy, typing, and nature and science. The performing arts had a strong presence at Jefferson. There was a drama club, a band, a chorus, and an orchestra. The orchestra was started in 1921. Several old Tattlers reported that the High Y Club was the oldest club at Jefferson. Formed in partnership with the YMCA, the purpose of the High Y Club was to create, maintain, and extend throughout the school and the community high standards of Christian character. One of the presidents of the High Y Club was Elmer Bartow, Bill Bartow's father. The High Y Club was around for many years. There may have been an older club, however. I found mention of a radio club in 1923. Other clubs were more recreational in nature. For example, there were clubs for bridge, chess, tennis and ping pong, and a club for girls called Stitch and Gossip. Next, we will discuss student publications at Jefferson. First, we will consider the annual publications or yearbooks. At first, the yearbooks were just called class books. The first class to have a class book was the class of 1916. The name Tattler was first used in 1923. Our museum has a complete set of class books and Tattlers from 1916 to the present, except for 1918, 19, 21, and 22. We believe the classes of 1918 and 19 were prevented from publishing class books because of paper rationing during World War I. We don't know if there was a class book in 1921 or not, but we don't have one. In 1922, recall that there was theoretically no senior class, explaining why we don't have a class book for 1922. My favorite Tattler is from 1939. In late 1938, our borough changed its name from Emos back to the original name of Emmaus. The class of 1939 obviously agreed with this change, and their Tattler screams the new name on just about every page. Beginning in the fall of 1922, high school students started a monthly publication. Just to confuse us, that publication was also called the Tattler. After 1 year, someone decided that a monthly publication was too much and the frequency was reduced. This continued to be called the Tattler until the fall of 1948, at which time it was renamed the High Jeff. My sister Faye was the first editor of the High Jeff. This is a fun topic, and it's one about which Andrew and I have a friendly disagreement. When the high school went from a 3-year to a 4-year program, the class of 1921 was the last class to have the 3-year program. The class after them had the four-year program and therefore would not graduate until 1923. So theoretically, there should be no class of 1922. That's why there's no class book in 1922. Well, imagine my surprise when I stumbled upon a Morning Call article dated May 24th, 1922, describing the 32nd commencement exercises of Emos High School held the previous evening. It sounded like any other graduation. Speeches were given, the band played, diplomas were given, but there were only 3 graduates. So I emailed the article to Andrew and I said, hey, there was a graduation in 1922. Well, he answered and said, I don't know what you found here, Jim, but this cannot be a real graduation. The 3 graduates are all members of the class of 1921. They're all in the 1921 class picture. You can't graduate from high school twice. Furthermore, we have all the graduation programs, and we don't have one for 1922. Well, I thought, that all sounded good, but I could not imagine this cheap school board allowing the expense of some faux graduation. So I went looking for an article about the 1921 graduation, and I found it. And sure enough, those 3 girls in question were all in that article. In fact, one of them gave a speech. So I thought to myself, maybe Andrew is right. No, I must be missing something. So I went back and I reread the end of the article and I counted up the names. There's 15 members of the class of 1921. Then I went back to the front of the article. Aha! There's 15 in the class, but only 12 graduated. So 3 of them graduated the following year. But why would those 3 have not graduated with their class? At first I thought, well, they must have been held back for some reason. But that didn't make sense because they were all good students. One of them became a teacher. And then it hit me. These 3 girls loved school and they were good students. They were in the last class to have the 3-year program. The class after them had the 4-year program. I believe these 3 girls, with the support of their parents, went to the school leaders and requested that their graduation be delayed by 1 year so that they could take the 4-year program. But they still wanted to be considered part of their class of 1921. They wanted to be in the picture. They even wanted to participate in the graduation. And I believe the school said yes. I explained my theory to Andrew and he said, you know, you might be right about that. But then later he said, you still haven't convinced me. I said, you're just being stubborn. Well, Andrew believes that he may be able to find one of the actual diplomas from one of these 3 girls, and that would enable us to look at the date. So I think I'm right, but in the spirit of humility, I'm going to put this down as one of the unsolved mysteries of Jefferson. If Andrew can come up with that actual diploma and we can look at the date, maybe we can settle it for sure. As early as 1937, a student wrote a strong argument for a new high school in the Quarterly Tatler. In 1947, the Emmaus School Board appointed a committee to look at a suitable site on which a new high school would eventually be built. 30 acres of land were purchased, and then an additional 13 acres were added. The 43 acres cost $43,000. While this was going on, the school board was discussing with nearby school districts about a merger. Their combined resources would make building a new high school more feasible. In 1950, the Emmaus School Board approved the merger. Emmaus voters approved it in 1951. The merger went into effect in July 1952. The new school district was called the East Penn Union School District and consisted of Emmaus, Macungie, Albertus, and Lower Macungie Township. Upper Milford Township joined a few years later. It was announced in July 1952 that Jefferson would become the district junior high school once the new high school was built. Construction of the new high school began late 1953, and the new high school opened September 1955. The class of 1953 was the first class to graduate under the banner of the East Penn Union School District, and the class of 1955 was the last class to graduate from Jefferson. I will conclude my presentation with two miscellaneous topics. In one last plug for my family, I want to show you this picture from 1955. Elaine was about to graduate, and she joined her older sisters, Faye and Carol, as being salutatorians in her class. I guess Mr. Heller forgave her for that dead mouse that she put on Miss Hauser's desk. Finally, adapting a suggestion made by one of my great nieces, I have chosen to designate the Jefferson graduate who, not counting family members, made the greatest impact on my life. For my selection, I reach back to the class of 1927. This is Albert Kratzer, president of the class of 1927. He was an outstanding student and a good athlete. He seems to have been involved in just about everything. He then graduated from Muhlenberg College and Temple Medical School, becoming a doctor. He opened up a practice on Chestnut Street in Emmaus. In 1937, Dr. Kratzer became the school physician for Emmaus High School. In the 1950s, he was the president of the local Board of Health. Dr. Kratzer enjoyed playing golf, and one time he had a hole-in-one, which was documented in the Morning Call. And he also was an avid trap shooter. But on the evening of April 19th, 1956, he did something really important. He delivered me. Well, several years later, when I was in bed with the measles, Dr. Kratzer came to the house with his black bag. He also came to the house with his black bag when my mother had the grip. When I was in 6th grade, I broke my wrist playing basketball on the Jefferson playground. Dr. Kratzer put my wrist and forearm in a cast, but before he did that, he had to set the broken bone. Now this is going to hurt, Jimmy. He was an honest man. Now, you may recall earlier I talked about Emma Kratzer, and you might be wondering if Emma and Albert were related. The answer is yes. Emma was Albert's father's sister. So, back in the late 1920s, while Albert Kratzer was taking his high school classes on the 2nd floor of Jefferson, his Aunt Emma was teaching elementary children down on the 1st floor, which I think is really cool. I hope all of you have learned something new about Jefferson School tonight. It has been my pleasure to present part 1 of my presentation. Please come back in September. There is a lot more history to cover, and I promise some really good stories. And at this point, I will take questions. Okay, well, you had your hand up first.
Okay. Okay, the list of the graduates in 21, the one list that was my second grade teacher at Washington School, Laura Reese.
Okay.
And I wonder, where did you grow up? I mean, what street?
On North 6th Street.
That's where we live at 322.
Okay, we were at 211 North 6th Street.
Okay.
Who lives beside of me?
Oh, really?
Yes, this was my next door neighbor here. Now, I got a call on my wife. I know there's other questions, but I need to call on my wife next.
Do you think in the beginning that the school board planned for Emmaus to be the high school?
You mean Jefferson
Or Jefferson, yeah.
to be the high school? Okay, this is a good question. When you read the articles back in that day, and you read about how the school board was trying to convince the public that they needed a new school, you don't see anything about them saying, well, we need a new high school. What you do see is we need classrooms, and we need them bad. We're averaging over 50 students per class. And so there doesn't seem to be any urgency back then that a high school per se had to be built. Now, could it be that the school board built the new school and later it occurred to them that it just kind of made sense for the high school to migrate towards the Jefferson building, especially once an auditorium was built? So I think if you would have asked me this question a year ago, before I started doing most of my research, I would have said, well, of course it was built as the high school. That's kind of like Emmaus lore, right? Jefferson was the high school. It was built as the high school. In this wonderful book, it says, the Jefferson building was erected on North Street in 1914 to accommodate the high school. Really? You know how many students were in the high school in 1914? 40? 50? You're going to build an 8-room school building for 40 or 50 kids? So it doesn't make sense to me that it was built as the high school. And we know from the records that there were elementary children in there for 15 years. And then junior high students in there for another 10 years. So if I could get Mr. Stoneback here for a couple of minutes, I would ask him that question. What was in the school board's mind? Were they thinking, let's build another school and eventually we're going to make it the high school? Or did it just happen that way? I don't think we can know for sure. But I would cast my vote for that's just the way it happened. I don't think it was immediately thought of as the high school. Good question. Who else? Yes, Bill.
Can you tell us more about when the bricks were coated yellow?
Okay. The thing that I found that was interesting was I found the article where they solicited the bids for getting the coating done. It was done in the summer. And then in August, I found another article soliciting bids to coat just the west wall. So it seems like they coated the entire building except for the west wall. And the funny thing is, if you look in the 1944 Tatler, which we have up here, you will see some pictures in the front that have the new yellow coating. And you'll see some pictures on the west side that have the original brick. Furthermore, in one of the monthly Tatlers that fall, you will see a student reporter was asking other students, what do you think of the improvements done around here? And one of them said, well, it looks nice, but why didn't they finish it? So for some reason, and I don't know the reason, but I don't know if the guy went out of business or what happened, but they didn't finish the job. And then they had to solicit another bid, and then later on they did the rest of the building. I thought that was pretty interesting. Who else? Yes?
My name is Landry.
Myself, my brother, and two sisters were delivered at home by Dr. Albert Kratzer. And I remember him as a very tall man.
Yes.
And he had a daughter by the name of Eleanor, I remember.
Uh-huh.
She was a very tall person.
Okay.
There was a boy there too, but I don't remember his name.
I never knew the family. I was delivered at the hospital, by the way. My mother was over 40, so as a precaution, I was born at the hospital.
No, we were all born at home.
Yeah. All right. Who else? Karen.
Did you not find any information at all about who owned the land prior to?
Okay, there is one possible clue about this. In 1910, okay, one or two more questions, they want me to stop. In 1910, there was someone by the name of Peter Schwartz, and then there was another Schwartz, I forget the name. And I don't know if they were brothers or father and son, but they died, and there was an estate sale. And these Schwartz brothers or father and son had elaborate land holdings in Macungie and Emos. And so there's a public sale, and it said that there was a series of lots between Elm Street and North Street that did not sell because the bidding price was not high enough, except for the little triangle between 4th, 3rd, and North Street, right next to St. John's UCC. That was sold for $100, but nothing else was sold. And then it said that they were going to be dealt with private sales thereafter. So I was looking in the newspapers at that time, and I just couldn't find anything else. But I have a feeling that it might have been the Schwartz land, but I just don't know for sure. Any others? Jen?
Was the first kindergarten free, or did the parents have to pay extra?
Okay. This is a funny story, too. The first kindergarten they had to pay for. And what's funny about it is the school board, being Dutchmen who are tight with the buck, and I can say that because I'm one too. They wanted the parents to pay the equivalent of the teacher's salary. What they didn't count on was that their constituents were also cheap Dutchmen, as were most of the people in Emos at that time. And so I'm not going to pay anything extra for it. So they were trumpeting the benefits of kindergarten, and yet they got a very poor turnout until they made it free. Okay, I think I'm about to get the hook. So if there's any other questions, please come up and see me afterwards.
Couldn't hear the question. No, I have another question.
Where's Jean? Oh, am I allowed to take more questions or not?
One more.
Okay, you go ahead.
The answer that you just gave, we never heard the question. So what was the question?
Just was kindergarten free, or did they have to pay for it?
When did they start kindergarten? Because when I went, it was only private kindergarten.
The first kindergarten was the fall of 1928. I had a slide on that.
What happened to it? Because I moved here in 42 and I didn't go to free kindergarten.
That I don't know. Maybe it was stopped and discontinued. That I don't know. I just know it was started, and that's all I know about it. Okay, I think I'm...
Let Ruth ask her question.
Okay, Ruth, you're the last one.
Okay, my father graduated from high school in 1913.
Okay.
Where would he have graduated from? Because the high school
Central.
from Central School.
Yep.
I have his book, but it doesn't mention that.
Yeah, it would have been Central. Because Washington was built at that point, but that was all younger grades. So it would have been Central. Okay? All right. See?
Okay, we would just like to thank Jim Schwar for a really interesting, fascinating